On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped the first atomic bomb ever used in warfare. It was a truly tragic event that led to a massive loss of life and capped off the most destructive war in the history of mankind. Regardless of the bomb's destructive power, people were still enamored with the weapon. The racism toward the Japanese during this time played a big role in this, but even in the present, people are still obsessed with these city destroyers. Ever since the day the bomb dropped, the media has been obsessed with nuclear weapons and what nuclear war and, more importantly, a nuclear apocalypse would look like. Books, movies, and TV shows do their best to communicate what this may look like, but nothing in this genre became more popular than the video games it produced. Specifically, the Fallout series. Inspired by the original Mad Max series and movies like A Boy and His Dog, Fallout has spanned almost 3 decades and has been a juggernaut in the gaming world since the end of the 1990s. The open-world action role-playing games take place in future America in a world torn apart by nuclear war between the United States and China. It's a series that touts its use of player choice, exploration, and diverse branching endings, as well as an infinite amount of ways to solve problems. Fallout itself has also been massively influential in the gaming world, changing the role-playing game field forever with its incredibly detailed stories and world building that is unmatched, bar none. The series is not without its faults, however. Over the course of its almost 30-year existence, 2 companies have seen massive success and failure with the franchise. Taking the bad with the good is almost required to be a Fallout fan, but Fallout's reputation has taken hits throughout its history and has almost cost it severely multiple times. It's not impossible to imagine this happening again in the future. Regardless of its few hiccups, both big and small, Fallout is a franchise that is still alive and well, and has a fan base that is still dedicated to every one of their releases, from main series games to the smallest spin-offs. Just like the games themselves, the development of Fallout has a history that runs incredibly deep. So deep, in fact, that their story doesn't even start with a game that has Fallout in the title.
Right now I'm hungry and I want to get laid.
That's what you always say.
You go find a chick and I'll hustle us up some food.
I can't do good work when I'm hungry.
You ain't pulling that crap on me again. And you can shove that part about how you lost the ability to hunt for food when you learned how to talk.
Like its spiritual successor, Wasteland is an open-world role-playing game. It was developed by Interplay and released by Electronic Arts on the Apple II in 1988. The top-down computer game was inspired by tabletop games that promoted creative problem-solving and had a clear cause and effect system like Dungeons & Dragons and Tunnels & Trolls. The plot is, unsurprisingly, very similar to that of the Fallout series. After a nuclear war brings a nuclear holocaust, the scattered United States Army is trying to bring order to a broken country. To do this, the player has to fight against mutated humans, normal people, robots, and AI. Like most role-playing games, Wasteland allows its players to shape their character in whatever way they would like based on name, nationality, gender, and 7 attributes: strength, intelligence, luck, speed, agility, dexterity, and charisma. These attributes are randomly rolled by the game itself, however, the player is allowed to re-roll until they get the attributes they desire. The player chooses skills or perks based on these stats. The gameplay itself is based on the player wandering the wasteland, completing tasks with their party of up to 7 non-player characters, and its extremely difficult turn-based combat. The world would change as the player progressed through the game, something that was unique to the gaming scene at the time. Wasteland did not hold the player's hand, allowing them to search for the story themselves and discover the world based on interactions with it and NPCs. Death was also permanent in this game, meaning a game over screen marked the end of a run with a certain character. Not only was the game insanely hard, but it was pretty long as well, spanning about 25.5 hours when only focusing on the main story. Despite all this, Wasteland was still praised by reviewers, and won Computer Gaming World's Adventure Game of the Year award in 1988. Looking at this game in the present, it's hard to imagine dumping hours of one's life trying to navigate the complex, difficult, pixelated world that it presents. Though it may not look like much now, this was the game that laid the groundwork for many role-playing games to come in the future. Following Wasteland's success in 1990, Electronic Arts released Fountain of Dreams, which was supposed to be a sequel to Wasteland. While it did contain many similar gameplay aspects, the game dropped the plot points that the audience found enjoyable in Wasteland, opting to make the story about killer clowns? Really? Consequently, the game was not well received by the disappointed public, as many reviewers even described the game as a dumbed-down version of the original. This was not a good look for the Wasteland series, but keep in mind that Fountain of Dreams was developed entirely outside of Interplay's creative and technical control, which led to this. After the release of both games, Interplay continued to make role-playing games, developing a few Lord of the Rings games aside other big-name titles and a few smaller-scale RPGs, but nothing Wasteland related. That would stand until 1994, when development for a new post-apocalyptic project began. The working title was Vault 13, a GURPS post-nuclear adventure, but was later changed to simply Fallout, as suggested by Interplay president Brian Fargo. The game's development was led by programmer Timothy Kane, the man who developed the engine for Fallout entirely by himself initially. It was more of a passion project at first, no one at Interplay being interested in Kane's idea other than the few devs whose help he enlisted. In fact, Kane began getting in trouble for distracting the other devs from their official Interplay work. I would send out an email saying, "I'm in conference room 2 with a pizza," Kane says, and if people wanted to come on their own time, they could do it. After gaining some steam, the project eventually caught the attention of the higher-ups at Interplay, but was still considered a B-tier project and a risk to be published. The game was called Too Depressing, a vibe that it was supposed to have. The destroyed world is supposed to be bleak and saddening. It's supposed to be depressing, Tim Kane says. Even with its dark subject matter being accepted, Fallout was constantly at risk of being shut down and was almost cancelled 3 times. In one instance, the entire foundation of the game was ripped out from underneath it. Fallout was originally developed on the generic Universal Role-Playing System, or GURPS if you're short on time. It was created by Steve Jackson Games in 1986. GURPS essentially allowed players to choose their character's abilities rather than getting them chosen at random like in Wasteland. It was the standard for role-playing games at the time, however Steve Jackson Games didn't like the atmosphere and story that Kane's team was creating for Fallout and pulled the use of GURPS last minute. It's not impossible to see why they did this, as the opening scene in Fallout involves a man getting executed with a pistol in a pretty grotesque manner. With one of the most important aspects of Fallout gone, the responsibility for recreating the rule system fell upon Tim Kane and his partner and lead designer, Chris Taylor. Fueled by pure fear and the desire to finish the product that they were so close to completing, they recreated the entire basis for the game in 2 weeks. From this insane crunch, the special system was created. S for strength, P for perception, E for endurance, C for charisma, I for intelligence, A for agility, and L for luck. The player was allowed to allocate a given number of points to each of these stats when they created their character. Though it was created in a hurry, the loss of GURPS led to the creation of one of the pillars of character creation in all of the Fallout games. The other instances of the game almost getting cancelled or almost getting completely redesigned came when Interplay wanted Kane to change the game to have more of an MMO style, like Blizzard's recent hit Diablo, and when Interplay acquired Forgotten Realms and Planescape Dungeons & Dragons. In both instances, Kane won the fight against executives and got to continue to make Fallout as it was originally planned. Though it was admittedly messy, the game that almost never existed finally was finished. A demo for the game came out on April 26th, and the official release came out on October 10th, 1997. Once seen as a risk by Interplay, Fallout came out to glowing reviews. The role-playing game genre had crashed in 1995, and Fallout came in to take the place of the usual medieval fantasy games that flooded the market. It did falter in sales to other games such as the previously mentioned Diablo, but it gained a very large fandom off the rip. The game was a top-down, turn-based RPG similar to that of Wasteland. Unlike Wasteland, Fallout used an isometric perspective, giving the world a more 3D look in a 2D space. It was originally planned to be a first-person game, but the idea was, for the most part, scrapped. I say for the most part because the first-person point of view did stay in one aspect of the game. During dialogue with important characters, the game would open up a window with a detailed image of the NPC being talked to with dialogue options. Though some are a bit uncanny, the Fallout team spent hours animating these in a style that remained present in the future games, though it's usually less scary in those. Interactions with NPCs as a whole improved mightily since the release of Wasteland, as voice actors were used frequently throughout the game. Through these interactions, the player could convince NPCs to join them in a companion system that the game introduced, though it was very buggy. The combat uses the usual turn-based system seen in similar games. Weapons found throughout the Wasteland also can be used in combat, bringing more variety to the battlefield. To make the combat feel even more unique, Fallout uses an innovative targeting system that allows players to select certain body parts on opponents. Hitting these parts can make them achieve the status of crippled, which changes their movement, aim, and perception. Character creation was also a very major part of the game, as it is in most RPGs. Creation involved choosing an age, name, and gender, allocating points into the previously mentioned special, and choosing what traits and tag skills the character would have. Traits are very similar to perks. In fact, you might even recognize some of these from the more recent Fallout games. Unlike perks, however, traits typically have a downside. For example, small frame is a trait that causes your character to be more agile, but it makes it so you can't carry as much in your inventory. Traits are completely optional and are typically used when you're trying to make a specific build for a character. Traits may be similar to perks, but perks themselves also exist in this game. Every 3 levels, the player is allowed to choose one perk to get massive benefits, this time without a downside. Like traits and perks, skills are a feature that has persisted in the Fallout games over the years. Skills are what directly influence how your character interacts with the world, combat, dialogue, or whatever situation the player finds themselves in. Based off your special attributes, skills determine how good or bad your character is at certain things. Tagging these skills in the character creation menu gives the player a 20% bonus in these categories. Only 3 of these are allowed, but skills can also be upgraded through leveling up. The game itself was filled with character, using the blueprint of a familiar world and technology and jerry-rigging it into something incredibly creative. Not content with extrapolating a plausible but unexciting view of the future, Fallout's design team instead crafted a vision of the future that combines 1950s Cold War American culture and early primitive computer technology. From its characters, weapons, futuristic yet very retro technology like the in-game menu The Pip-Boy, and various knockoff brands, Fallout builds a world that's uniquely its own. The variety of enemies also makes the game diverse in its conflict, with a slew of humans, mutants, and other wasteland creatures such as the Deathclaw hunting down the player character. Nuclear wastelands have been done many times before, and still, Fallout creates something that feels brand new. As far as the story goes, the game takes place in 2161 in Southern California, where the player is asked to retrieve a chip that will allow the character's nuclear shelter, or vault, to have access to clean water reserves. This point is important to the gameplay, as this is a task that needs to be done within a certain amount of time in-game or the player would get a game over. This is one aspect of the game that Tim Kaine and the rest of the team were on the fence about. He wanted to use the time limit to enhance the urgency of the mission, but it ultimately ended up making it so the vast open world felt much less accessible for the player. Even though those who played the game say the 150-day limit is plenty of time, Kaine says that this is the part of the game that he wouldn't have included if he could go back. Though it did have a handful of bugs, what the Fallout team did with little money, time, and support was absolutely incredible. But rather than celebrating this accomplishment, the Fallout team began working on a follow-up to their new smash hit. On October 29, 1998, Fallout 2 was released for Microsoft Windows. With the success of its predecessor, Fallout 2 was given much more attention from Interplay. However, this game would be developed by Black Isle Studios, which led to big changes in the development of the game. While Fallout was developed in the free time of Interplay devs as a project that they truly cared about, Fallout 2 was created with more commercial success in mind. The game's general ideas were based off what Tim Kaine, lead artist Jason Anderson, Leonard Boyarsky, and Chris Taylor made, but the project was quickly turned into one that didn't resemble what the original game stood for. Because of this, the 4 ended up leaving the development team. It did feel like the heart of the team had gone, and all that was left was a bunch of developers working on different aspects of the game like a big patchwork beast. But there wasn't a good spine or heart to the game, we were just making content as fast as we could. All of this led to a game that was very tonally inconsistent. The game's writing was kind of goofy in parts, and not always in a good way to some. Tim Kaine cited the loss of Anderson and Boyarsky as the reason Fallout 2 lacked the dark tone that the original was full of. Though the development and tone of the game was off compared to the last, the gameplay was still very consistent with the first game, reusing most of the aspects of character creation, combat, NPC interaction, and the top-down world style. The patchwork development actually led to the world being bigger in scale than the original Fallout, something the game was praised for. While it wasn't perfect, it was still Fallout, and that's exactly what the public wanted. Fallout 2 received very positive reviews from critics and gaming magazines alike. It was also a big commercial success, selling over 120,000 copies in the US by March 2000. Despite the differences between the first and second game, Black Isle Studios capitalized on the success of the series and still created a product that was received very well by the Fallout community. So much so that some of the wacky presentation present in Fallout 2 is still present in today's games. Even though it wasn't exactly what he envisioned, Tim Kaine relented that he was still very proud of this team and what they had done with the game in such a short period of time. Fallout 2 was absolutely a success, but it would also be the last mainline Fallout game that Interplay would release. Still, 2 more spin-off games would be dropped under their name, Fallout Tactics and Fallout Brotherhood of Steel. While Tactics was generally viewed as a success, Brotherhood of Steel was the opposite. Fallout Tactics was a stripped-down version of the first 2 games, focusing mainly on combat and is more of a strategy game than anything else. The game got solid reviews and was the favorite game the developers at Microforte had ever worked on. Fallout Brotherhood of Steel, on the other hand, was not positively received. Developed and released by Interplay in 2004, Brotherhood of Steel was the worst reviewed Fallout game at the time. The game diverged from the original series and chose to make the game in a linear world, a strange decision considering that open world exploration was one of the main factors that helped Fallout become so popular. The player is confined to zones where they engage in combat. Still, from the top-down perspective, BOS drops the turn-based style used in all the other games and switches to a more real-time fashion of fighting. The game also featured local co-op abilities, making it the first time any Fallout game featured a multiplayer system. The game was extremely simple and not in a good way. Fallout Brotherhood of Steel was bashed by both fans and critics. Despite all of this, however, the game still had a sequel planned. It seems Interplay knew that the first Brotherhood of Steel wasn't very good. They were using it as a platform to pay for the development costs of the engine and to fund the second game. They went out of business before they were able to execute this plan. This would be the last time Interplay released any Fallout game. Though an official sequel to the first 2 games was in the works, Fallout 3 was eventually cancelled by the company. Project Van Buren was being developed by Black Isle Studios and would have taken on a similar form to the first 2 games. Development was looking promising for the game, but shortly after production began, Interplay cancelled the project and would sell the rights of the Fallout series, officially shelving Van Buren indefinitely. Since it was never released, Van Buren stands as one of the biggest what-ifs among Fallout fans. The game had a very interesting premise and a brand new combat system that would have made the game a great addition to the franchise. Certain features and plot points would find their way into future games, giving some solace to Interplay Fallout fans. The money that the franchise was bringing in for Interplay got in the way of what Fallout was supposed to be, and it cost Interplay the series as a whole. With Fallout out of Interplay's hands, everything about the new game was up in the air. Anything was possible, especially with their new developer.
Hope this interaction doesn't lead to any kind of fallout between us. Fallout New Vegas.
My cat's gonna record the next part. Founded by Christopher Weaver in Bethesda, Maryland, Bethesda Softworks made a name for themselves in the gaming industry with the development of the Elder Scrolls games. With the first being released around the same time as the original Fallout, the Elder Scrolls were a series of 3D RPG fantasy games that were praised for similar reasons that the original Fallout games were. Over the course of multiple sequels, Bethesda grew in size and numbers, creating Bethesda Game Studios in 2001. Bethesda's work on Fallout 3 began in 2004, shortly after Project Van Buren was cancelled by Interplay. In 2007, Bethesda would acquire the rights to the Fallout franchise for $5.75 million. The game would be built from the ground up on the Gamebryo engine and would feature a first and third person perspective rather than the typical top-down one seen in the first 4 Fallout games. The game would be directed by Todd Howard, designed by Emil Pagliarulo, Estevan Pelli, and Joel Burgess, and programmed by Steve Meister. A big fear with the franchise switching companies among the fans was that the game wouldn't be Fallout enough. The team's PR rep Pete Hines put this fear to rest. "We're a bunch of Fallout geeks. There's nobody here who hasn't played the game and enjoyed it. I have the game on my laptop, I take it with me and play it." After Interplay tried to pull Fallout in a direction that was more money and commercially oriented, who better to take over development of the game than a bunch of fans? Bethesda wanted to revive Fallout, and they might have been the perfect studio to do so. The first map design of the game dates back to 2005. Fallout 3 takes place in the ruins of Washington, D.C., a location that diverges from the franchise's usual West Coast areas. The map would be the smallest in the franchise at this point and would remain the smallest Fallout game scale-wise to this day, but it was originally supposed to be twice the size it was. According to Joel Burgess, developing Washington, D.C. block by block was a production nightmare. Even in the final game, you can see D.C. had to be split up into different sections that could be traveled between through metro tunnels, which are confusing to say the least. With the city not being exactly what they envisioned for the game, it might seem like this was a big disappointment. However, Fallout 3 compensated for this lost space by filling the map outside of DC with intriguing areas, missions, quests, secrets, and NPCs. Combat changed significantly with this iteration, as Bethesda dropped the turn-based style in exchange for a traditional action RPG combat. The game was first-person, with a third-person option that nobody uses, and took on a classic shooter style of gameplay. The combat was decent in terms of feel, but you definitely couldn't compare it to, say, Call of Duty, and it often wasn't praised for being a top-tier shooter. Bullets had variation, the ADS was basically non-existent, and even when you had your aim down, ammo is scarce in the Wasteland and preservation is encouraged. Enter the Vault-Tec Assisted Targeting System, or V.A.T.S for short. Inspired by the ability to shoot certain body parts on enemies in the original game, V.A.T.S is the Fallout game's version of bullet time. With the push of a button, the game world freezes and the player is allowed to select whatever body part on their enemy, or soon-to-be enemy, that they want to attack with varying degrees of success. This can be done at the cost of replenishing action points, or AP, a system that carried over from the turn-based games. This feature's main goal was to increase accuracy, save ammunition, and was a lifesaver in difficult situations like close quarters combat. This allowed players who weren't the best at shooters to still have an enjoyable experience with the game. Keep in mind, a lot of the fans of this franchise loved it for its role-playing and exploration, and were more used to turn-based combat. Bethesda did change a great deal about Fallout, but they also kept many of the things that made the series what it was. Special, perks, and skills all found their way into the game without much tweaking needed other than the combination and exclusion of a few skills. A new detail of character creation that Bethesda added was the addition of a customizable appearance. Now, instead of just deciding on gender, you can spend an hour making the most uninspired looking character possible. I did Randy Marsh in my first playthrough. The plots of the original Fallout and Fallout 3 were also not too dissimilar. In Fallout 3, the player lives in a vault when one day their father up and leaves. The player character follows, being sent from place to place in search of him. Come to find out, the player's father is working on a project to give clean water to the DC Wasteland. While not exactly the same, you can definitely see that Fallout 3 took some inspiration from the original. The game's main questline is fairly linear, but the player is allowed to explore the wasteland and engage in whatever side quests they please. There are also plenty of ways to problem solve in the main quest, from high speech, science, good and bad karma decisions, and classic shotgun diplomacy if you want. Taking the general framework and lore from the first few Fallout games, Bethesda makes something uniquely their own, and yet so familiar. Fallout 3 was reviewed extremely positively and was well reviewed by most Fallout fans. There were some groups that did not take a liking to Bethesda's new game. Sections of fans, like the one called No Mutants Allowed, was a group that rejected Fallout's take on the series for all sorts of stupid reasons. No, but seriously though, this group does have some valid points to make about the reduction of player agency and changes in the writing style. While they're not completely nitpicky, most of the complaints come down to personal preference in games. Fallout 3 sits at a 90 or above on Metacritic on every platform and received multiple Game of the Year awards. This massive success would continue as 5 separate DLCs were released for this game: Operation Anchorage, The Pit, Point Lookout, Mothership Zeta, and Broken Steel, which served as a direct expansion of the main quest line. All of these would eventually be combined into the game's Game of the Year edition. Following the new style's massive success, Bethesda knew they had to keep the hype for the series going while they still could. Unfortunately for them, the majority of their resources began to be dedicated to the Elder Scrolls V, Skyrim, making it impossible for them to allocate more work for another game to their already overworked devs. However, they did have one ace up their sleeve that could make it happen. Obsidian Entertainment was founded in 2003 by former Black Isle employees Fergus Urquhart, Chris Avallone, Chris Parker, Darren Monahan, and Chris Jones. The group had worked on some major projects such as the sequel to the original Knights of the Old Republic, but the studio was still in its infancy and trying to get its foundation. Regardless of their experience, the crew had some serious talent and, more importantly, some serious love for the Fallout series. There was really no better development team Bethesda could have chosen. Bethesda wanted Obsidian to work on a franchise that Urquhart, Chris Taylor, and the rest of the team knew quite well, Fallout. They came to us and said, "We think it'd be cool if you did something on the West Coast," Urquhart said. We were like, sure. Excitement was absolutely warranted, but the clock was also ticking. Fallout New Vegas had a development window of just 18 months, as Bethesda wanted it on the shelves before Skyrim dropped in 2011. While they didn't have to develop an engine, Obsidian still had to remake the assets and models to improve the game's experience. This led to long work hours and a more stripped down version of a Fallout game as far as map creation goes compared to what Bethesda had done with Fallout 3. Despite all this, Obsidian still managed to deliver a masterpiece that some still call the greatest Fallout game ever released. Many of the features from Fallout 3 would carry over to this game, as they used 3 as a framework for New Vegas. The character creation system, V.A.T.S, companions, karma, and everything UI related found its way into the spinoff. But there would be no point in making a completely new game if they wouldn't include new features. Obsidian, trying to make the game worthwhile for Fallout fans, did their best to include fresh ideas that would set the game apart from Fallout 3. The first inclusion was a rehashed crafting system. Crafting is available in Fallout 3, but it is very shallow and requires the use of schematics to craft certain items. New Vegas uses this idea and makes it more practical and viable for players to invest in. Based on a character's repair skills, the player can craft ammo of all types, armor, heals, chems, skill books to increase stats, weapons, and other miscellaneous items. The player can also deconstruct ammunition for basic parts. This put more stock into building the repair skill of a character, as in Fallout 3 it was mainly used for weapon repairs and a few side quests. A new mode was also added to New Vegas called Hardcore Mode. This was the series' first realism mode, and it made the game more of a survival simulator than it was in vanilla. The mode requires you to eat, sleep, and drink regularly, and go to the medic to heal crippled limbs. It also adds weight to ammunition and makes it so medical items like Radaway and Stim Packs heal your respective stats over time as opposed to healing instantly like in the base game. Companions would also die upon reaching 0 hit points instead of gaining the status of unconscious. Speaking of companions, Obsidian improved that element of Fallout 3 as well. The companion wheel was added, which allowed players to manage their companions in one menu, rather than having to talk to them all individually. Each companion also had their own side quests now, adding depth to what was, for the most part, just an AI turd in the previous games. Seeing as many of the Obsidian team were part of the development of the first 2 Fallout games, many of their ideas were based off used and scrapped ideas from Fallout 1, 2, and Project Van Buren. Taking place in the Mojave Desert, New Vegas' main storyline is based on a war going on between 3 factions, the New California Republic, Caesar's Legion, and Mr. House. In all of these factions and smaller groups throughout the Mojave, the player gains a reputation. Helping one group will improve the reputation with them and have negative effects with the opposition. Whatever faction the player aligned themselves with had massive influences throughout the game. It would completely change the ending depending on what group the character sided with. Making a new product out of something that had already been done is what Fallout prides itself on, and Obsidian carried on with this tradition with extremely little time. And while New Vegas definitely felt a little bit emptier and lacking in terms of scale compared to Fallout 3, what Obsidian did with the time frame they had was nothing short of amazing. There was one major problem with the game upon release, however: a lack of debugging. The little time Obsidian had to make Fallout New Vegas also meant there was little time to playtest the game as well. The game would release with a lot of problems, ranging from minor graphical glitches to the inability to launch the game entirely. This was obviously a problem for the fans that wanted to play and enjoy the game they had just spent $60 on, but it was even more of an issue for Obsidian. In their deal with Bethesda, both parties agreed to terms that would give Obsidian a large bonus if Fallout New Vegas achieved an 85 or higher on Metacritic. For a small studio that's trying to make a name for themselves, this was a big deal and would give them a large boost for years to come. Even though the game was released in a messy state, the writing, combat, and role-playing were so good, it would surely crack an 85. Right? An 84. Fallout New Vegas scored an 84 on Metacritic. Without this bonus, Obsidian was in big money trouble and, as a result, let go of many of their staff. It was an unfortunate result for a game that was so good outside of the faults that were, for the most part, fixed in future patches. Outside of its Metacritic score, Fallout New Vegas was received very positively, receiving multiple 9 out of 10s and a few awards as well. Obsidian would not work with Bethesda again after this project, which, while understandable, is a shame. New Vegas is regarded among fans as one of the best Fallout games ever to release, some even putting it higher than some of the mainline Bethesda and Interplay games. Obsidian would eventually create a very Fallout-esque game called The Outer Worlds, created by Leonard Boyarsky and Tim King, and would eventually be acquired by Microsoft. Bethesda would continue to create Fallout games, with varying degrees of success. And they were bought by Microsoft too. Development for the next Fallout would be done solely by Bethesda Game Studios and would be a sequel to Fallout 3. The main ideas for Fallout 4 would arise sometime in 2009, and full-time production for the game would begin halfway through 2013. One of the biggest inspirations for the game in early development was what the world looked like prior to the nuclear war, which was seen in the game's ads and introduction. The team of around 100 devs would develop the game in the Creation Engine, which was created by Bethesda themselves for Skyrim. The use of the new engine allowed Fallout 4 to be much more graphically advanced than its predecessors, who weren't exactly praised for their jaw-dropping presentation. The game's camera would also be slightly different, dropping the talking head style of NPC interaction for a more cinematic camera angle. In terms of gameplay, Fallout 4 was very similar to both Fallout 3 and New Vegas. The one major change was the inclusion of a building and settlement system. Players were allowed to build their own bases with the materials they find in the Wasteland. These bases attract NPCs and merchants and would create makeshift trade posts throughout the world. These locations can be unlocked by completing quests because another settlement needs our help, and while they were definitely an interesting idea, the concept received mixed reviews. I think Tony and Eddie Burback put it the best way possible.
Towns in Bethesda games are one of the highlights of exploring their world.
You walk into a town, there is conflict, there is storytelling, there is atmosphere and culture. It's a really great experience. But in Fallout 4, they tried a new settlement system where you could build your own base and attract other NPCs to come live in your town that you created. They replaced the plots of land that would have been Bethesda's curated towns with culture and story and everything else I said.
Towns like Megaton, Canterbury Commons, and Good Springs are all examples of these towns in Fallout that create such a wonderful experience for the player. They're great hubs for side quests, trading, housing, and overall world building. And while these types of settlements aren't absent in Fallout 4, they don't exist in large numbers like they do in, say, Fallout 3. On the other hand, many new fans like the customization available. Drew Gooden makes a good point about this, saying that he thinks it's a great starting point for new fans. I think I initially sunk 100 hours into the game. About 20 of those hours were spent trying to build a giant treehouse. The new system was in no way a disaster. It wasn't even really bad. It just didn't feel like Fallout. Another big change this game saw was the change in dialogue. Instead of having a massive catalog of dialogue options, the options are confined to, in the words of Nakey Jakey,
it essentially boils down to generic good guy option, generic bad guy option.
This is just the quote your favorite creator section. Fallout 4 was received very well by critics and absolutely hit it out of the park in sales, becoming Bethesda's best-selling game to this day and has sold over 13.5 million copies. New fans really enjoyed the game, but older fans on the other hand enjoyed it a little bit less, citing the lack of immersion, stripped-down dialogue and role-playing, and the lack of side content that was so prevalent in the previous games. It's difficult to say if a game is good or bad because it's completely based off opinion, especially when it comes to a game that has both good and bad aspects like Fallout 4. In my opinion, as a standalone game, I think Fallout 4 is fine. It's not the best at one thing, but it's definitely not a bad game. It's far from it, in fact. However, as an iteration of the Fallout franchise, Fallout 4 is absolutely one of its weaker entries as far as role-playing goes, which is the main draw of the series. Disregarding all of its flaws and reception among longtime fans, Fallout 4 was still a success for Bethesda, and they had the money to prove it. With that cash, Bethesda wanted to do something that had never been done before in Fallout history. Back when Interplay sold Fallout to Bethesda, there was one detail I left out about their contract. Interplay was allowed to develop one more Fallout game, a massively multiplayer online version of their previous games. The idea had been bounced around prior to this, but it never came to fruition. Even with this deal, the game never happened, causing Bethesda to file a lawsuit against Interplay. Now, with Fallout bigger than it had ever been, Bethesda wanted to give this style of game a shot. Fallout 76 was announced on May 30th, 2018 and was set to release on November 14th that year. The game shares many of the same gameplay elements as Fallout 4, the only major difference being the substitution of the single-player system for a multiplayer one. There was another big difference between the two games though. While Fallout 4 was pretty buggy, Fallout 76 was a complete technical disaster. The game was riddled with catastrophic glitches, more than any Bethesda game before it. Even today, some say that the game is still unplayable. When Fallout 76 released, a lot of the hate was directed at the devs and playtesters, but little did the fans know that Bethesda's work environment was one of the major reasons this game was dragged down. 76 was a game that was too massive in scale to handle for Bethesda's B team in the short amount of time they had. With a map that was even larger than Fallout 4 and even less time to create it, the team was forced to work long hours during major crunch for the game, which took a toll on many employees. The game lacked serious direction, the leads of the project even calling in playtesters to test a fix that wasn't even completed once. I remember seeing one of my coworkers stand up, look at the person who was in charge that day, and scream across the room, "Why are we here? We gave up our day for this. This build isn't the build we need. This is useless. This is a waste of our time. Like, why are we here?" This is just one of the many examples of devs being treated poorly while working on this game. If you'd like to know more, I highly suggest you read Kotaku's article on it. Management was poor and workers were watched by their superiors on breaks to ensure their time was being used properly. New recruits for 76 dropped like flies, often quitting soon after being put on the project. Needless to say, it wasn't a good environment for anyone. Fallout 76 was not a mainline Fallout game, but it was given the scale and hype of one without the resources to make it happen. None of what happened with Fallout 76 was the fault of the testers, the devs, or anyone who cared about Fallout that was on the project. Bethesda did what Interplay did and let greed cloud their vision of what Fallout was supposed to be, and they were heavily criticized for it. Fallout 76 is the worst reviewed Fallout game of all time, and for good reason. On top of 76 being a complete disaster, people began to call into question if they should trust Bethesda as a company, not only because of their mistreatment of workers and subpar recent releases, but for their shady practices around the game as well. A subscription service and a battle royale mode being implemented before the game-breaking bugs were fixed is a great indicator of what Bethesda's intentions were with this game.
This is a simple lie detector. I'll ask you a few yes or no questions and you just answer truthfully. Do you understand?
Yes.
So, what's next? Well, Bethesda has confirmed that a new Fallout game is coming out sometime in the future, but seeing as both Starfield and The Elder Scrolls 6 have both been officially announced, it's safe to say it's going to be a while before a new Fallout game hits the shelves, and that's probably a good thing. It's been proven time and time again that Fallout isn't a game that can be rushed through development. The only time this really worked was when the game was being labored over by people who truly love the idea and the franchise. That's not to say that Bethesda doesn't love Fallout. They obviously do. They released one of the best Fallout games of all time, Fallout Pinball. It's very obvious that the Bethesda crew has a love for this game, but this break might be a great opportunity for them to reflect on what they want the next game to be and how to make the experience great for not only the people playing it, but for the people making it as well. I put death in the title as a question because going into this project, I wasn't sure what the consensus within the Fallout community was, but the people people that make and the fans of these games are more passionate than they've ever been. The modding community for every Fallout is thriving, making anywhere from simple quality of life improvements to completely combining the two maps of Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas. You can go into any Fallout subreddit and ask what the users want in the next game and get a post that's longer than this Word doc right now. A great gauge for the Fallout community on whether or not Bethesda can still deliver a good game is with Starfield, which comes out in about 2 months from this recording. And based on articles that may or may not be true, the game is looking promising stability-wise. I don't know who their source is, but keep in mind, I would not believe a word that comes out of this man's mouth. Just don't do that to yourself, please. Though we may have to be a little more cautious with purchasing their games in the future, Bethesda still has the potential to deliver a product that's worth getting lost in. And I'm sure there's hundreds of developers / Fallout fans that are foaming at the mouth, waiting to get the green light for the next game's development. Fallout is absolutely not dead, it's just dormant. If all it took to get this series started was a group of coworkers over a box of pizza, it shouldn't take much more than a push to get it back on track. This was incredibly long, and I have to work in the morning. It's very late, so I'm gonna go to sleep now. But thank you for watching. I really do appreciate it.